They called it a lawsuit, cold, calculated, legal. But tonight, the world hears something far rarer, a confession. Not from a man in chains, but from one who once held the gavel. A judge of the Western world now stripped of titles, stepping into the light not to speak from power, but to fall before truth. He does not offer explanations. He does not hide behind legal precedent. Instead, with trembling voice, he says what the world has long waited to hear. I failed Africa. I failed Burkina Faso. I failed Ibrahim Traore. What happens when justice turns on itself? When the hands that once signed orders of judgment now write words of remorse? What kind of shift shakes the soul of a courtroom and brings a nation once judged to the center of history? This is not just a story. It is a reckoning. Stay with us, this is no ordinary confession. It's a reckoning long overdue. Subscribe and stand with us for a justice that sees Africa, hears Africa, and rises with Africa. It began with numbers, three simple figures, 600 million. On the surface, it seemed like just another dispute among nations, wrapped in the sterile language of international law. A contract, a debt, a claim. But beneath those digits lay a fault line deeper than any ledger could show. The case was filed in a court thousands of miles from Ouagadougou, far from the red soil of Burkina Faso and the voices of her people. It was presented as a matter of obligation, legal, binding, neutral. But the courtroom was anything but neutral. It was a stage, and Africa once again was cast not as author, but as defendant. At the center stood a young President Ibrahim Traore, a soldier turned leader whose name was barely known outside West Africa just months earlier. Now, it echoed through legal chambers in Washington, New York, and Geneva. They accused his government of defaulting on agreements tied to foreign contracts. They said Burkina Faso owed $600 million for breach of terms. What they did not say, what the documents could not capture, was that the people of Burkina Faso had chosen sovereignty over submission. They had chosen land, labor, and dignity over foreign dictate. The lawsuit moved swiftly. It was reviewed, processed, judged. Behind closed doors, legal teams sharpened their arguments. Media outlets framed it as yet another sign of African instability. Burkina Faso faces legal reckoning in international court, one headline read. But what no one expected, what shook the very foundations of that courtroom, was how President Traore responded. He did not send a delegation to negotiate. He did not appear by video link to defend. He did not ask for leniency. He stood before his people and said, "Our sovereignty is not for sale." The words hit like thunder, not just in Ouagadougou, but across the continent. In Accra, in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Bamako, people listened. They understood the stakes. This was not just about Burkina Faso. This was about every African nation that had ever been told its dignity could be measured in dollars. This was about the ghost of colonialism, dressed now in legal robes and financial verdicts. The court, unmoved, issued its ruling: Burkina Faso must pay. The reasoning was clear, precise, and utterly indifferent to history. But something had changed. For once, it was not the ruling that mattered, but the resistance. President Traore refused. He did not pay. He did not yield. Instead, he spoke to his people not in legalese, but in the language of struggle. They may put our name on paper, but they will never put chains on our spirit. And the people answered. They filled the streets, raising flags, lifting his portrait not as propaganda, but as protest. They saw in him something rare, not just a politician, but a reflection of themselves. A man who dared to say no, where others had nodded. And far away, in a quiet office beneath the marble pillars of Western justice, a judge sat alone. He had signed the ruling, thinking it was just another day at work. Just another nation, another line on a map, another judgment filed and forgotten. But he could not forget. Not this time. Not when the streets of Africa roared louder than his courtroom. And so began his reckoning. The robe that once comforted him now burned on his shoulders. The gavel, once a symbol of order, now echoed like a weapon used without wisdom. He started to question, what is justice if it cannot hear the cry of the colonized? What is law if it serves only those who wrote its rules? He began to write, not a defense, but an apology. Not to the legal profession, not to his peers, but to the very people he had wronged. To President Ibrahim Traore, to the mothers in Ouagadougou, to the fathers in Bobo Dioulasso, to the children who would grow up believing their country had been put on trial, not for what it had done, but for what it dared to be free. And in his writing, the judge began to see what had been invisible to him for decades, that this lawsuit had never been about 600 million. It was about 600 years of pillage, silence, indignity, and control. And for the first time in his long career, he realized that he had not ruled on a case. He had ruled against a people. But this was never just about 600 million. It was about 6 centuries of silence finally breaking. The courtroom may have fallen silent after the ruling, but the continent did not. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from the dusty villages to the humming capitals, the echoes of resistance rippled outward. What began as a legal matter now stood revealed as something far deeper, a moral earthquake. At the center of it, President Ibrahim Traore remained unshaken. With arms folded behind his back and eyes fixed ahead, he addressed his nation not with legal citations, but with ancestral memory. They want to weigh our worth in currency, he said, but our value was paid long ago, in chains, in blood, in silence. The streets of Ouagadougou erupted, not in chaos, but in conviction. Young people, many born after independence, took to the avenues carrying placards not of protest, but of proclamation. Dignity is not negotiable. Burkina Faso is not for sale. We are not defendants, we are descendants. In Mali, students chanted his name alongside that of Sankara. In Ghana, old men nodded solemnly at news reports they'd never thought they'd live to see. Even in South Africa, where the courtrooms had once judged apartheid, voices rose to ask, what justice still lives, if Africa must always explain its defiance? And far across the ocean, in a country whose laws had once inspired the world, one judge could no longer sleep. In his chambers, Judge Robert read and reread the judgment he had rendered. It was flawless in form, bulletproof in logic, indisputable in precedent. And yet, it felt hollow, soulless. The phrases that once carried the weight of authority now rang with a cruel emptiness. Obligation, default, award granted. He looked up, saw his reflection in the polished wood of the bench, and barely recognized himself. That night, he began his confession not in a journal, but in a speech. One line became a dozen became a torrent. The truth surged out of him, not as defense, but as surrender. I did not fail the law, he wrote. I failed the people the law was meant to protect. He remembered the arrogance that guided his pen, the ease with which he dismissed Burkina Faso as if it were a spreadsheet entry. He saw, clearly now, that it was not merely a ruling, it was a reenactment of colonial theater. The stage was cleaner, the costumes more refined, but the outcome was unchanged. Africa judged by those who never answered for what they took. And as he wrestled with this realization, another voice entered the frame, the voices of African scholars. From university halls in Nairobi to online forums in Dakar, they called this moment not a legal debate, but a reclamation. The century of Africa rising, they said, will not be litigated in foreign courts. It will be authored by Africans. The judge watched footage of young protesters holding up portraits of President Traore. But they were not idolizing him. They were recognizing something within themselves. A defiance older than borders, deeper than debt, a belief that sovereignty was not a policy, but a birthright. He saw images that haunted him. A mother in Ouagadougou cradling her child, whispering, "You will not be born in chains." A father in Bobo, hoeing dry earth, wearing a shirt that read, "We are not their subjects." And a child barefoot, eyes fierce, pointing at the screen and asking, "Why do they think we owe them?" The judge, now stripped of illusion, began to understand that his gavel had not struck justice, It had struck memory, and memory fought back. His apology, when it came, was not polished. It was not negotiated by aides or shaped by lawyers. It was raw, personal, shocking. I failed you, Ibrahim Traore. I failed your people. And I failed the very justice I swore to uphold. He did not speak as a jurist, but as a man. And in doing so, something profound shifted. The apology spread like fire. Media called it unprecedented. Diplomats called it dangerous. But in African capitals, in rural homes, among elders and activists alike, it was heard as something long awaited, not an end, but a beginning. A signal that even within the heart of the system, something was breaking open. As African youths lifted portraits of Troy, the judge saw what law books had never shown him, truth from below. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the numbers disappeared, but the consequences remained. Burkina Faso did not collapse, as some in Western boardrooms had quietly hoped. Instead, it stood still. Not with the quiet of surrender, but with the stillness of resolve. The economy strained, yes. Foreign aid was halted by those who once claimed to be partners. Trade agreements were reassessed. International banks tightened their terms. In many ways, the cost of defiance became immediate, tangible, brutal. Yet in Ouagadougou, something unexpected bloomed. It was not despair. It was dignity. Markets continued to bustle. Children still walked to school. Farmers still tilled their soil beneath a relentless Sunday. The people of Burkina Faso had known hardship before. But this time, it carried a different name: sacrifice for sovereignty. Across the nation, murals began to appear, not ordered by the state, but painted by hands of youth. One showed a pair of broken chains forming the shape of the African continent. Another depicted a courtroom turned inside out, with the judge kneeling and the people standing. The meaning was unmissable. Power had changed direction. Politically, the effects were just as stark. In parliament, opposition members who once doubted President Ibrahim Traore found themselves silenced by the strength of public sentiment. This was no longer a question of party or policy. It was a question of pride. To criticize the stand he had taken now felt like betraying something older than any constitution. Even traditional leaders, once skeptical of the military-born president, came forward to speak of unity. A chief in the Sahel region said it plainly. He did not just defend a country, he defended memory. And memory, as the judge would later write, was the most powerful currency of all. Outside Burkina Faso, the ripples were harder to ignore. In Mali and Niger, young leaders cited the Traore stance in their own speeches. In Ethiopia and Kenya, editorial writers debated the limits of international law in the age of African reawakening. The phrase Africa Rising was no longer abstract. It was being lived, page by page, street by street. Inside the United Nations, unease grew. Diplomats struggled to frame the event. Was it a challenge to international order or a correction long overdue? Behind closed doors, some asked what many feared to answer. What if more African nations followed suit? What if the bench of the world could no longer summon obedience? In legal circles, the confession of the judge shook foundations. Law students quoted his words, "Law without justice is tyranny." Professors debated his legacy. But among African jurists, there was something more than debate. There was relief. At last, someone had said it aloud. The problem was not with African governance alone. The problem was with global governance built on unequal roots. But perhaps the most lasting consequence was emotional. In Bobo Dioulasso, a man who had lived through 2 coups stood outside a radio shop and wept. Not because of hardship, he had seen worse, but because he said, "For the first time, I saw someone powerful say he was wrong and mean it." Children in schools repeated President Traore's line like scripture, "Our sovereignty is not for sale." Mothers told bedtime stories of how their country stood before the world and did not flinch. And somewhere, in a quiet Western office, a judge stared once again at the verdict he had written. It remained unchanged on paper, but in the heart of Africa, it had already been overturned by the people. Because no ruling, however eloquent, can outlast the will of a nation awake. If you believe Africa was never meant to be judged in foreign courts, type "Africa can do it" below. And while courts debated numbers, the streets were shouting something far louder: dignity. In Washington, the apology fell like a thunderclap through the corridors of power. Not because a judge had admitted error that alone was rare enough, but because of what he admitted. That sovereignty, African sovereignty, had been treated not as principle, but as inconvenience. American media split quickly. Some praised his courage, others condemned his words as weakness. "Judge Robert betrays the bench," one headline read. But the judge was unmoved. For once, he did not care for reputation. "The highest oath is not to a flag or a courtroom," he said, "but to truth." In Europe, diplomatic statements came laced with caution. Brussels urged respect for international legal mechanisms. Geneva spoke of concern over precedents. But in Africa, the message was already clear. The game had changed. A precedent, far more powerful, had been set not of law, but of humility. Within legal institutions, unease turned to introspection. In private meetings, senior jurists asked, "If the law is blind, why does it always seem to look away when Africa speaks?" Even within the United Nations, where resolutions are drafted in the language of neutrality, younger diplomats from African nations began to press harder. They cited Burkina Faso. They quoted the judge. They demanded that sovereignty be treated not as a line on paper, but as a lived right. And throughout the diaspora, especially among African Americans, the apology struck a nerve. Civil rights leaders, pastors, community organizers saw in Judge Roberts' confession a kind of moral breakthrough. "We've marched for equality here," one elder said in Atlanta. "But that fight is tied to theirs. And now, someone in power finally said the truth out loud." What made the apology so impactful was its totality. Judge Robert did not apologize for tone. He did not hedge with legal nuance. He did not protect his colleagues or soften his words. He looked directly at Africa and said, "I was wrong, we were wrong." And to his fellow Americans, he offered a warning. Africa is not waiting for our permission. Africa is not bending under our weight. Africa is rising. And our choice is simple: respect that rise or be left behind by history. It was a message not just for lawyers or presidents, but for the entire global system. A reminder that the old balance of power, built on whispers and debts, on contracts and conditions, was cracking. He was not just apologizing to a president, but to a continent no longer silent. What happens after an apology echoes across continents? Does the world listen or retreat into silence once more? For Burkina Faso, the road ahead remains steep. Sanctions may tighten, investment may waver. The international community may attempt to isolate what it cannot control. But the people are no longer waiting for permission to dream. And for Africa, the question is no longer, what if? It is what now? The defiance of Ibrahim Traore lit a spark. But a spark alone does not build a future. That future requires structure, legal reform, economic independence, regional solidarity. It requires leaders who resist not only foreign pressure, but the temptations of internal corruption. It requires citizens who understand that sovereignty is not just a slogan, but a discipline. There are risks. A continent asserting itself may face backlash from the very systems that once defined order. But there is also opportunity. An opportunity to create a new framework, one rooted not in charity or compliance, but in partnership and respect. And that starts with telling the truth, even uncomfortable ones. Africa rising is not merely a dream, it is a responsibility. The world may doubt, but Africa must not. Not now. Not when the tide is shifting. Not when elders still remember chains and children now carry banners of liberty. Not when voices once ignored are beginning to shape the global story. The judge said, "This apology is not the end, it must be the beginning." So what must come next? African institutions must grow stronger, sovereign not only in name, but in practice. African education must reflect African values, so children grow up learning their worth, not their burden. African law must protect African lives, not just obey foreign precedent. And African unity must no longer be a conference slogan, but a living reality. Because if one nation can stand, then others can rise. This apology was never the final word, it was only the first crack in a wall about to fall. This story began in a courtroom, but it ends far beyond its walls. It ends in the hearts of millions who, for too long, were told to bow, to accept, to remain silent. But now, from the dust of judgment and the echo of apology, something new is rising. Ibrahim Traore stood when others expected him to fall. He spoke of sovereignty not as theory, but as living truth. And in his stance, he reminded the world of something it had forgotten, that Africa is not a continent to be judged, but a civilization to be honored. And for Judge Robert, the gavel has fallen for the last time, not to condemn, but to confess. His voice, once used to legitimize control, has now become a mirror reflecting the arrogance of systems and the dignity of resistance. But the real verdict lies with us. Will we hear his words and carry them forward, or will we file them away as yet another moment unfulfilled? That choice belongs to us elders who remember, youth who dream, and a global community that now watches as Africa Rising becomes not just a movement, but a milestone. Let history record this not as an isolated apology, but as the first turning, the moment when dignity was no longer debated, but declared. The moment when Ibrahim Traore stopped being a headline and became a horizon. If this story sparked something deep within you, don't just watch, respond. Like, share, and speak up. Subscribe, because Africa Rising is not just a phrase, it's a prophecy. And it starts with Ibrahim Traore standing, so we may all stand taller. Drop your voice in the comments with New Africa. Africa Rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa.